In 1972, Atari released the video game Pong, which became the world's first commercially successful video game. Fast forward half a century, and video games have become a multi-billion-dollar industry with cinematic graphics and tremendously sophisticated storylines and gameplay mechanics. And I think we're well past the point where the relevant question is, but is it art? And the question should rather be, what kind of art are we looking at here, and how best should we think about it? Now, in this lecture, I do want to think about games in general in relation to art and not just video games. But I want to begin by saying a little bit about video games because they are the form of gaming that most frequently garners comparisons with art. And one way of approaching this is to rewind a couple of decades to a sometimes fractious debate within the game studies community between what were called narratologists on the one hand and ludologists on the other hand. Now, narratologists were noticing the increasing sophistication of video games, and they then brought with them the tools of literary analysis to analyze the ways in which games work, how they function as stories, and how those stories may work on us and generate meaning. One objection then raised by ludologists was that the narratologists were not really treating video games as an autonomous art form. They were really treating it as a subspecies of storytelling. And you see this often when people are asked to comment on what they find most special about the video games they most cherish. We'll often talk about the cinematic nature of the story and the story world that they're dealing with, which is fine and good. Obviously, there's a lot to be said about some of the sophisticated storylines in video games. But the thought is, if you want to narrow in on what is it specifically about video games as games that makes them special, you haven't yet said anything that maybe distinguishes them from movies. So it seems as if one of the crucial features of video games as a distinctive art form, as an autonomous art form, is their interactive nature. So that even the most cinematic video game, while it resembles film in many respects and is often parasitic on and is often making reference to film in many respects, one thing that's distinctive about it is, unlike in a film, you can interact with a video game so that you are one of the characters acting in this game and you are able to engage with it and affect the results that come from it. And so one distinctive feature of games, it seems to be, is this interactive character. And if we're going to think about video games as art, it's important to think about them in terms of an interactive art form, which in many respects radically shifts the relationship between the audience who is consuming the art form and the art form itself. In thinking about the nature of games as an interactive art form and the role of the player in those, I want to draw out 2 points of comparison. So one is theater. Let's say you go buy a ticket because you want to go watch Hamlet. So you go and you sit in the audience, you're just sitting there, and you're watching some actors on stage who are performing a play. Now, that play was written by Shakespeare. What the actors are doing is they're interpreting and performing the play that Shakespeare wrote. So in a sense, you've got two layers of artistry here, right? You've got the artistry of Shakespeare, the playwright, who wrote the play, and then you've got the artistry of the performers who are putting on this particular performance of it. Never mind the artistry of the director and the lighting designer and the set designer and all the rest, but I want to suggest that one of the things that's distinctive about performance art is, and this applies to performances of music, to dance, and all the rest, is that you have sort of two levels of artists. You have, you might say, the author of the work on the one hand, and then you've got the people performing the work on the other. And then you've got an audience who are watching it. Compare that then to, you buy a ticket to go see a basketball game. And there too, you have a sport that has an author. I mean, I chose basketball because it's one of the rare sports where I can point and say there's this guy, James Naismith, who invented basketball. So, you know, James Naismith is the Shakespeare of basketball. He kind of is the author of the sport. And then on any given occasion, you've got particular athletes who are playing the game. Now, one of the salient differences here, obviously, is that we typically and straightforwardly call theater art, whereas we don't normally call basketball art. And yes, we can, and I will talk more about that later, but there's a question of why we don't sort of automatically just sort of put it in the category of art. And I want to suggest two reasons for that. One is that sports are not necessarily or essentially performance arts. That I could go to a gym and play some pickup basketball with some friends, and it doesn't matter if nobody's watching. The game is just as much of a game as otherwise. Whereas if you put on a play and there's nobody in the audience, either you're in a rehearsal or you're in a total dud of a play. And either way, it's somehow deficient as a play. It's not really a play unless there is an audience there to watch it. So in that sense, plays are sort of essentially made for an audience in a way that games, or sports rather, are not. The other difference, I think, is the nature of what I might call the interpretation of the work. So that artists are communicating something through their interpretation of the work, just as Shakespeare is communicating something. That art, often, if not always, is essentially communicative. And it's a bit more of a stretch to say that about games. That we can say about great athletes or great game players that they are artists of a kind, that there is something distinctive about the way that LeBron James plays basketball, or Serena Williams plays tennis, or Mikhail Tal played chess, that show a sort of an understanding of the game that shows a certain artistry, but is not communicative in quite the same way, at least, as the way that actors interpreting a play are. So I don't want to litigate this. I'm not trying to claim like for these reasons sports are not art, but just to suggest here are some differences that maybe suggest why we are naturally inclined or naturally predisposed to call theater an art form, whereas it's more of a kind of a metaphorical stretch, or at least you have to make an argument to defend the claim that basketball, say, is an art. And so the two reasons I was suggesting, one is that theater essentially requires an audience, and the other is that theater is essentially communicative as an artistic medium. Now let's put video games in the middle of this. And I think there's an interesting question then of whether people playing video games can be artists. And not just video games. And I think actually the more interesting case is even tabletop role-playing games, because in a video game, you have a sort of a software that has already kind of put the game together and structured it in a certain way. When you and a bunch of friends get together to play Dungeons and Dragons or something, there's a lot more creative input from the players. Does that mean that the players are collaborating in telling the story in the way that maybe performers are? Or are they more like game players, that they're sort of acting out a game rather than sort of acting in a game, playing a game rather than performing? So I think there's some sort of interesting questions to be asked about the role of the interactivity in a game, and in particular whether there's a space for saying that players of games should count as artists of a kind, performers of a kind. I'm mostly inclined to say no. I mean, especially in video games, I'm inclined to say even the most dazzling video game players are more like great athletes than they are like great theater artists. I think there's maybe a little more room if you're talking about a tabletop role-playing game where the players have much more creative input in the telling of the story. But there too, it seems as if with even role-playing games, there's no external audience for whom the game is being played. An audience can watch, and certainly esports has become a big industry. But sort of like with sports and unlike with theater, an audience isn't an essential part of the performance. And in that sense, people aren't playing for others in quite the same way. Now, another interesting feature about role-playing games, and this is true of both video game role-playing games and tabletop role-playing games, is precisely that there is a role being played. And I think this is importantly different from the case with ordinary sports, in the sense that in an ordinary sport, people are not playing a role. Now, let me be a bit more precise about that. You might say, but of course, there's a certain persona that comes with playing certain games. One classic example is the enforcer in ice hockey, that you've got this role of the big tough player who will get on the ice and will beat up on the opposing team, especially if they rough up the star player on the enforcer's team. And often these enforcers are known as quite mild-mannered people in ordinary life, so they sort of take on this tough guy persona when they're playing the game. But nevertheless, the enforcer isn't pretending to be someone else. Dave Semenko is appearing in the role of Dave Semenko. Bob Probert is appearing in the role of Bob Probert. Gino Ojic is appearing in the role of Gino Ojic. These people aren't kind of claiming to be someone other than they are, even if they're taking on a different role. It's more like the way that, I could be the funny guy at a party, or I could be the serious intellectual. Both cases, I'm being myself. I'm not pretending I'm somebody else. I don't want people to call me by a different name. But I can just adopt different personas to suit different circumstances. And we all do that. There's nothing, I think, special about sports with that. But with a role-playing game, if I say I'm going to now be Elric the dwarf, um, I'm not simply kind of taking on a different persona. I'm taking on the persona where I'm saying, like, this other character is the one that I'm playing. And there are then some really interesting, I think, ontological issues with this. Supposing I am playing Elric the dwarf in a role-playing game where I have to go off and slay the dragon. Suppose I do that. Who is it that slayed the dragon? Is it Elric the dwarf, or is it me? Now, in some obvious sense, it's Elric. He's the one in that world who did the slaying of the dragon. But there's a common way that we talk about playing games, where we say, I passed the level, I defeated the boss, I slayed the dragon, and so on and so forth. And I want to suggest that that's not just metaphorical. There's something true about that. As the player of the game, it is indeed I who did the thing. And yet, it's also the character that I played. Now, here's a bit of a puzzle, right? I could say, I slayed the dragon. I could say, Elric slayed the dragon. I could also say, only one person slayed the dragon. And also, I am not Elric. Those four statements, I slayed the dragon, Elric slayed the dragon, only one person slayed the dragon, and I am not Elric. All four of those claims can't be true all at the same time. And so there is an interesting puzzle about how we relate to our avatars in games. It's as if we kind of reach through from our world into that world in order to affect the outcome of the game. And I think this is one really interesting way in which games as interactive are different from traditional forms of storytelling. Supposing I'm watching a production of Hamlet and I can see where all of this is going, and I hop onto the stage and say, no, Hamlet, the sword is poisoned, don't get in this fight. I won't have saved Hamlet and a bunch of other people from dying. What I'll have done is broken up the play, and everybody will be quite annoyed with me, both the actors and the audience. One of the things that's interesting then about interactive games is precisely that I can reach in to the world of the story, that there isn't this sort of insuperable boundary. So with traditional storytelling, while the story can sort of affect me in my world, there's nothing I can do in my world to affect the story or interact with the world of the story. But with role-playing games, there's a way in which I can reach into the world of the story. Now, I personally cannot enter the world of the story, but I have these things called avatars, whether it's Elric the dwarf or whoever else. It's as if I can sort of reach into the story and get a character in the story to act on my behalf. And I think that's sort of a very interesting feature of how interactive stories are different from ordinary stories. But it also, I think, raises some interesting puzzles about what my causal relation to that world is, and whether, again, it's correct to say that I did something in this world, and how that relates to the fact that the character in the world did something in that world. Okay, I've talked a bunch about video games and role-playing games. I promised at the beginning of this video that I was going to say something more general about games in general as art. And to do that, I'm going to draw on a really interesting recent book by the philosopher Thi Nguyen called Games, Agency as Art. And Nguyen's central argument is that games are a distinctive art form, and they are distinctive in virtue of the fact that they are the art of agency. Now let me spell out what that means. So the thought is that every art form takes place in its own distinctive medium. So painting takes place in the medium of paint on canvas, music takes place in the medium of sound, fiction takes place in the medium of a written word. And the thought is that each one of these art forms is taking some aspect of our, you might say, ordinary experience and focusing it in particular ways. So for example, painting takes the fact that I use my eyes and I see things, and it, you might say, crystallizes something about the nature of seeing. It kind of gets me to appreciate the experience of seeing in distinctive ways and makes me attend to the experience of seeing in a way that I might not ordinarily. And Nguyen wants to say that games do the same thing with agency. That is, my capacity to do things and to decide to do things. So that, throughout my day, I'm doing a bunch of stuff and I'm making decisions and all of the rest. But in a game, as Wen puts it, sort of sculpts my agency in very particular ways. You know, in soccer, it will say, now there's this very specific thing I want you to do. I want you to get that ball in the net, and I don't want you to use your hands. And suddenly I discover in trying to do that, I discover all sorts of things about my sort of foot-eye coordination, how I move with balls, how I move through space. I might recognize my relation to other people. I start to discover very specific things about the nature of agency within that constrained domain. Or, take a very different example in chess. I'm suddenly forced to think about how I make decisions within a strategic context. It engages my spatial imagination and my logical and decision tree reasoning and so on and so forth. But in all of these games, what the person who made the game does is place very specific constraints on what I can and cannot and must not do, so that I have a very distinctive experience of my own agency. And just as painting gives me a very distinctive experience of my own visual capacities, Nguyen argues that games give us a very distinct experience of our own agency. And it's by reflecting on and savoring the experience of playing a game that I come to a deeper and richer appreciation of my own agency, and also the different forms that agency can take and the different kinds of ways in which I can give expression to my capacities as an agent.